This is a lesson on rounding, the rules for rounding. Our example we're going to start out with is round 25 and 873 thousandths to the nearest 10. So we're going to follow the 6 steps that are listed here in figuring how to solve this problem. So underline the digit to be rounded. We talked about the digit being in the 10th place. So what I would underline is thousandths, hundredths, the 8 is in the 10th place. Look at the neighbor to the right. So for some of you, it might help if you build a box or a house and you look at the neighbor to the right. Something that looks like a juice box. So if we look at the neighbor to the right, it's a 7. Number 3, recite the rhyme. 5 or above, give it a shove. 4 below, leave it alone. Well, I look at the neighbor to the right of the 8, it's a 7. So indeed, it's 5 or above, I give a shove. Number 4, if the neighbor is 5 or greater, which is the case, we add 1 to the underlined rounding digit. So that would be the 8. Since the 7 is greater than 5, we would change the 8 to a 9 by adding 1 to it. If the neighbor had been 4 below, we would have left that underlined digit alone. We're looking at number 5 here. Change all the digits to the right of the underlined digit to zeros. So I had underlined the 8. Everything to the right of the house becomes a 0. And it says all digits to the left remain the same, with one exception, which we'll talk about later. So I would put a decimal there and repeat the 25. So the answer to 25 and 873 thousandths rounded to the nearest 10th is simply 25.9. We can get rid of those 2 zeros because zeros to the right of a decimal don't change the value of the number. So if I look at some examples, looking at our steps, let's take a look at 75 and 8/10. I'm going to round this one to the nearest whole number. So I underline the digit in the ones place. I build a house. I look at the neighbor. 5 or above, give it a shove. So it's an 8. So I would shove that 5 to a 6. Everything to the right, I can't forget that decimal, becomes a 0. And to the left, the numbers stay the same. So 75 and 8/10 rounded to the nearest whole number is simply 76. I look at the next example, number 18. You see the number, the digit in the hundredths place is underlined. So I'd be rounding to the nearest 100. I look at the neighbor. We're talking again about an 8. So what I would do is 5 or above, give it a shove. That becomes a 6. The 8 turns into a 0. Everything to the right of the underlined digit is a 0. Everything to the left remains the same. So the 7 would remain the same, the decimal, and the 0. So 758 thousandths rounded to the nearest hundredth would simply be 76 hundredths. I can drop that 0 because it doesn't change the value. Number 19, we're looking at rounding to the nearest ones. I build the house. I look at the neighbor. Wow, these are all 8s. All 5 or above, I give it a shove. The 3 becomes a 4. Everything after that turns into a 0. Everything to the left of the house remains the same. So what I would have is 643 and 82 hundredths rounded to the nearest ones becomes 644. Our last example, we're taking 472 thousandths. We're rounding it to the nearest 10th. Again, I underline it, build the house, look at it. The 4 would become a 5. Everything to the right is a 0. Everything to the left stays the same. So in 20, our 472 thousandths rounded to the nearest tenth becomes 5/10. Let's cap our answers and compare them. And in fact, we see that everything was correct. The one exception we talked about earlier is, let's say I asked you to round 1,239 and 98 hundredths to the nearest ones. Step number 1, underline the digit in the ones place. In this case, it's a 9. I build a box. Look at my neighbor. 5 or above, I give it a shove. So that 9 would become a 0 or a 10, which means I would have to change the 3 to a 4. 1 plus 3 is 4. And then everything else does say the same. So that's the exception there. As this 9 becomes a 10, I have to increase the digit directly to the left. And then here I keep my decimal. Everything else becomes a 0. So 1,239 and 98 hundredths rounded to the nearest ones becomes 1,240. That's our lesson for today on rounding.